I keep picking topics which are controversial and which need some factual illumination rather than emotional editorials, which are now increasingly frequent on the subject of outsourcing. The objective today is to define outsourcing in terms of a cartoon. Outsourcing can either be a way for a company to gain strategic altitude and rise to greater heights, or it can be a way of just unloading dollars that don't pay off. The question is it rising or losing if you outsource? And that is the purpose of my discussion today. So before we dwell into the subject matter, let's first define the terms so that we can actually measure and so that you would be able to perform calculations that will allow you to take your particular company's financial statement and measure the degree to which they do or don't outsource. Now, the definitions are simple. A company's profit and loss statement is made out of profits and cost of sales. Cost of sales consists of depreciation, interest, or taxes, outsourcing, and operations. And operations then has either overhead or direct costs. I will be devoting a particular amount of attention to the role of overhead costs with regard to outsourcing. In order to put some reality into the definitions, here are the results of my studies of 769 U.S. corporations with a total volume of $795 billion, which shows that outsourcing accounts for 46.6% for these corporations, which is a fairly indicative median value of what is the cost of outsourcing. I want to draw your attention to the fact that the corporations are only producing whatever output they are generating, with 22.4% of their costs, the direct costs. And that is then an indication that outsourcing today as a factor of production is greater than the actual employment that generates the goods which are generic to a particular company. Now, once you start outsourcing, you are basically moving out of your factories production out to subcontractors who may or may not be located in the United States. Nevertheless, they are still outsourcers. And therefore, in addition to managing your company through the traditional overhead, you now have to not only manage the internal direct labor, but you also have to manage the work done by suppliers. And the supplier chain may stretch out throughout the globe and consist of hundreds and sometimes thousands of contract suppliers. This raises the whole question of system design for the last 20 years, which were surrounding the issue of what's called enterprise integration. If you do enterprise integration only within the boundaries of the corporation, under these kind of rules, you are going to miss the bulk of the cost that needs to be managed. And therefore, the era of enterprise integration is over. And that means that you now have to talk about enterprise not as something confined by the name of the company, but the enterprise as defined by the chain that will stretch indefinitely all over the globe. So if you then have all of the sources outlying out there, you have created a complexity which previously did not exist, And now you have to say, well, is this added complexity which has been created in search for lower labor costs, in fact, worth doing? Now, in order to evaluate this question, whether it's worth doing or not, I will be using today two ratios. There are more. All of you will be lucky to read my next book so that you have more things to do. Meanwhile, however, I will just satisfy you by two simple ratios. The outsourcing ratio, which is outsourcing divided by direct cost, and overhead divided by direct costs. Now, let me just show you what the profile for 769 corporations looks like on the outsourcing ratio. On this distribution, you see the big blue line that 250 of the 769 corporations, in fact, have an outsourcing ratio that is less than 50%. The rest of them are stretched out all the way to ratios as high as 700, which means for every dollar spent inside your own factories, you have $700 floating somewhere all over the globe, which gives you a median of 75.6%. Now the question is this profitable? And I just love to do scatter diagrams. And as you could see, when you plot the outsourcing ratio over the return on shareholder equity, which is as good measure of profitability as any, you will find there is no correlation between the outsourcing ratio and the shareholder equity, although later on I will start focusing on the winners and the losers in this group. But as a rule, to say that outsourcing is bad for you doesn't hold up. Only bad outsourcing is no good for you. Let's look at overhead ratios. Same sample of 769 corporations. The median is 124%, which means overhead is more than your direct labor, which is becoming a typical characteristic of US corporations, where there's always more people in the office buildings than in the factories. We are becoming an overhead economy. You have overhead ratio under 100%, mostly very small companies, but the bulk of them have, again, large overhead ratios stretching all the way to 350%. And again, when you look at, is overhead bad for you? Because there is some kind of a sociological bias about the idle people in corporate headquarters. The pattern is that in some cases it's bad for you, in many cases it's very good for you. So overhead is not a disease, it is a phenomena. It is a reflection of managerial organization, not of economics. So let me then summarize the first epistle of tonight's lecture, and that is outsourcing and overhead ratios. Outsourcing is 75.6% of corporate direct costs and is rising. I've plotted some of these things now for almost 15 years. I will show you some samples. They are always rising. So outsourcing is becoming more prevalent, and the title of a corporation being a hollow corporation is in fact an apt description of what is happening. Overhead costs now exceed corporate direct costs. Part of it is due to headcount, most of it due to the fact that you are paid more money if you are in overhead than if you are doing direct labor. So it is a stratified compensation system. The lawyers and the accountants in corporate headquarters get paid more than shift supervisors in a factory. So although none of it correlates with profitability, my conclusion is that if you want to make a judgment about outsourcing, which is a favorite political loaded kind of editorial topic these days, the people who write about it don't know what they are talking about, because it's not outsourcing, but it is whether management does or doesn't do it well. Now, that's the generality. I pride myself on making sure that instead of talking about generalities, from educational standpoint, one should look at case studies. General Motors is, or used to be, the largest American corporation. At one particular point, a famous man said what's good for General Motors is good for the United States, and therefore I will use your permission to use General Motors as a case study. Now, what I'm showing here is that the blue bars are employee count. In 1986, the employment of General Motors was 875,000. The employment of General Motors in 2004 is slightly over 300,000, which means the employment is down by 2/3. Now, how is that possible? Well, it is possible because the outsourcing ratio increased from 150% to 575%. So there is a classic case of a historical shift where you make a trade-off between employment and outsourcing ratios. I would say there are other cases like this, but clearly General Motors is the most noteworthy example of this phenomenon. As you take labor out from direct cost and don't scale down corporate headquarters, and in fact, if you hire more lawyers and financial analysts in order to do the negotiations for outsourcing, you will increase your overhead cost. And this is exactly a history of General Motors, where the ratio of SG&A, which is sales, general, and administrative cost, to cost of goods sold, went from a multiply of 6 to a peak value of 18. And then, of course, bad times came and they started cutting overhead costs, but they are still out of range from its historical experience, and certainly out of range with the overhead cost of the competitors. Now, those of you who are not acquainted with the economics of overhead costs should understand that much of the literature that you read sort of fuzzes up the issue of what is overhead. And so if you don't like overhead, you put another name on it. This is clearly the practice in Washington. If you don't like a program, you just rename it. And some of the names that overhead has been tagged with is called collaboration cost, coordination cost, intermediation cost, a Harvard professor special, transaction cost, structural cost, etc. Regardless what you call it, it's still the same. It is the burden of coordination and overhead which provides the matrix in which a corporation gets managed. Where does information technology come into all of this thing? You must understand the foremost claim to fame and economic justification of overhead cost reduction comes from the fact that information technology claims that it can reduce coordination, cooperation, and all the other overhead costs. And so the pronouncements that have been made now consistently with public relations by the CIO of General Motors was, well, we increase sales by 13% and we cut information technology by 25%. Now, if you are a CIO and you want to get a raise and a bonus, this is exactly the kind of statistic that you would present to your management. And in fact, it looks so good that you would clearly commend a person who has managed to do so. Now the question is this the way to evaluate IT? And you are in a course of IT, and therefore a IT view of General Motors outsourcing is appropriate. So let me leave the 25% reduction of information technology up as a green. But let's compare it then with some other numbers. The number that I like to use is the BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis. This is government statistics, which shows that, in fact, information technology is getting cheaper. This is not Moore's Law. Moore's Law would actually show a bigger number. This is Moore's Law and disk space and a mix, mumbo-jumbo mix, which BEA has been using. But at any rate, in the years from 1997 to 2004, whatever you had as computers in 1997 should now cost 67.9% less, according to the government. So if you cut your prices by 25%, well, maybe you don't look so good. Now, another reason why you have IT is to support employees. Now, if you cut employees by 46.7%, just cutting IT by 25% doesn't look so good. And then, as a sideline, somebody called shareholder still sits there and says, well, you know, but I got 73.2% less. So all I want you to know that the theory of relativity does not only apply to physics, but also applies to corporate statistics. So the shareholder view, which is really dominant view, is that the outsourcing ratio went up 242%, the overhead ratio went up 502%, profits went down by 4.7%, shareholder equity went down, and in a period from 1986 to 2004, General Motors earned less for shareholders than putting the money in a savings bank that pays very little money. So the score sheet here is dismal and should raise a question of how one should then analyze the kind of numbers that you will receive once you become a CIO, and you have to explain with credibility of what you are doing for shareholders, for the employees, and for management. Now, before you go away, somebody will then ask the question, well, all right, now how well are you doing as compared to the competitors who are eating your lunch? And then you have to do also as a CIO benchmarking. It's called benchmarking against competitive indicators. And I just have a whole bunch of these. I don't want to bore you with it, but in this particular case, I want to focus on inventory. General Motors sales increased 5.7% in 5 years. Inventory went up 92%. Toyota sales increased 34.3%. They increased market share, but their inventories actually grew less than their sales. And Honda, a clear gainer in market share, also kept inventory in line with sales increase. There are other indicators like this, but I just want to point out to you that when you do CIO IT benchmarking, don't ever consider simple indicators like percentage of revenue as a proof of anything. So The ultimate way to look at a company is in terms of a balloon. Are you outsourcing and shedding dollars and increasing market share, or is it going the other way? And here is the story, namely that while the outsourcing was going on, the market share has kept decreasing monotonically, which means that the overall record of General Motors and many of the companies associated with this have really shown a great liability for the US economy. The outsourcing did not stop market share erosion. Value chain did not improve with outsourcing despite claims to the contrary. Despite decrease in employment, outsourcing overhead went up, and IT has not been successful to alleviate the enormous pressures that have been placed on the management of General Motors. Now, at this particular point, you may well say, well, okay, Strassmann, you picked a basket case. You picked a company that has a particularly pathological problem. Is that a fair way of analyzing outsourcing? And it's a fair comment. What I'm doing now is to show you the methodology that you should be using when you are confronted with analyzing a corporate profit and outsourcing performance, and looking at the question of how can you then evaluate whether indeed the performance is superior or not. And in order to make that comparison, I picked the comparison between General Motors and Caterpillar. The reason I picked Caterpillar is because geographically and demographically, the workforce are quite comparable. They are engaged pretty much in the same sort of work, and they show different patterns of performance. Let me start with employment. Although General Motors' explanation of decline of the workforce and outsourcing is based on the need to pursue cheaper labor, when you look at Caterpillar, as General Motors declined employment, Caterpillar was growing employment pretty much in the same marketplace. Slightly different unions, slightly different conditions of wage, but nevertheless, from standpoint of demographics, Caterpillar has very substantially managed to gain employment. What is more interesting, however, is that Caterpillar does outsource. Their outsourcing has been pretty level at about 63.8% for more than a decade, while General Motors was pursuing policy of headlong outsourcing. Now comes the real question of outsourcing, because that will be the subject of my lecture next time, and that has to do with what is really the underlying issue of all outsourcing. Because you don't only outsource labor, the most important element from a standpoint of national policy, it deals with the question of knowledge value, and particularly knowledge value per employee. This is a topic that will deserve much attention in the lectures to come. I want to point out to you that the knowledge value per employee of General Motors during a period of outsourcing has steadily hovered around $50,000, which does not even pay for a decent return on the wages that are paid, and going negative in 2004, and a horrible negative value of knowledge capital for the first 3 quarters of 2005. Meanwhile, Caterpillar was able to increase knowledge capital in the same market, with same workforce, same demographics, by and large a profile that has the same educational background. So this is a very important piece of analysis to consider when you do an evaluation of information technology and the whole issue of economics of a firm. Now, you could then say, well, all right, but Caterpillar pays Chinese wages and General Motors pays $85 an hour with full benefits. So obviously Caterpillar is in a better shape. The answer is this is not so. The average employee compensation during the period of outsourcing for Caterpillar has always been greater than the average compensation for General Motors. Now you could say, well, it's a different workforce, it is structured differently. In fact, that is not so, because the question of average compensation and knowledge capital deals with the issue of the mix of what you keep as organic to the company and what you outsource. This is a managerial issue of managing the mix. So let me then summarize the General Motors versus Caterpillar's case. Despite higher wages, Caterpillar increased employment. Despite high level of outsourcing, knowledge value of Caterpillar is gained. Now, this has vast implication about the future of American industry. There is no need for us to say and wring our hands that, cheap labor in China and in India is going to really take away our living. This is not so. There are ways of strategically managing the mix by which you divide your labor skill and particularly knowledge capital, which still makes us the winner. Let me now proceed to the next piece of the presentation today. I will just give you a flavor of some research findings. The purpose of doing that is strictly to illustrate methodologies. You are a university here. A university thrives from research. As students, you should acquire the habit of skeptical analysis of what is alleged to be a fact. For instance, during the intermission, I was approached by one of the students asking whether Carr's article in the Harvard Business Review, namely that IT does not matter, in fact, is a reasonable critique of IT. If you were properly trained in this school, and I'm sure you are, Dean, then you would be looking at the Carr article the way I looked at it. And by the way, my letter criticizing Carr was printed by the Harvard Business Review, where the article actually had no factual basis for any of the statements that were made. It never received tremendous exposure everywhere. So now let me concentrate on research and what you should start doing as a discipline of skeptical analysis. One of the things that I always do is don't look at averages or medians, but look at the extremes. In other words, much of the value of research is not in averages, but in the tail ends of a statistical distribution. It's a very important insight for you to appreciate. In this particular case, I look at 1,110 firms, global firms. This includes German, English, French, Italian, and Dutch firms. And what you find that if you stratify the sample, something I always do, you will discover that in fact the top-ranking firms, despite the average not being significant, the upper layer and the lower layers show differences in behavior. Again, I don't want to get involved into a discussion of experimental statistics. I do hope that the students are taking a course in statistics, which allows them to look at tails of distributions rather than averages. What I want to convey to you is that there will always be outsourcing. Now, I don't know if you can see it, although you have handouts, but everybody outsources anywhere in the world. And these are global firms, and they differ. And the amount of outsourcing is not necessarily associated with a particular standard industrial code, SIC classification. It is a characteristic of management. And therefore, management analysis is the way how you should look at outsourcing. There are stratifications, however, in certain industries. So in the consumer discretionary business, which is supermarkets and so forth, you're likely to find higher ratios at the extreme, but not at the median. I don't want to dwell here on the statistical refinements, but I'm using this particular chart just to warn you against averages and medians as a description of any way to look at research results. Now, the question is it true that, and this is a hypothesis, and then you have to either prove a hypothesis or not prove a hypothesis. Here's a small sample of a study that I've done. And the question is it true that once a company becomes rich and pays its employees well, that the tendency to outsource will increase? This is, of course, repeated again and again, that our workers are overpaid and therefore they are attractive sources of outsourcing. Here is a small example from a much larger sample comparing the high-paying Johnson & Johnson that outsources 45% and has a very high return on assets as compared with Wyeth that pays almost 35% less, has a higher outsourcing ratio, and earns less. Again and again, I want to alert you as students and researchers to really look at the numbers very carefully and critically. The fact is that outsourcing is essential. You cannot grow an economy without outsourcing. Outsourcing is really what the economists call 300 years division of labor. You have to find more efficient producers in order to optimize the so-called factors of production. The question then is not whether you do or don't outsource. The question is, can you guarantee that it is economically effective? And that really depends on the value chain that you go out to manage under outsourcing conditions. I've now used the term value chain, and let me now go into a discussion of the role of the value chain in outsourcing decisions. I will start with a case study. Case study that everybody is acquainted with. It is a mouse. The mouse made by Logitech, and I want to point out to you that the labor cost, including overhead, is only $3 on a $40 retail discount mouse. So much for the advantage of Chinese labor. The suppliers of the parts mostly come from other countries, and about half of the chips that go into a Logitech mouse actually come from Texas Instruments in Texas. The big chunk of the inputs for the Logitech mouse actually come from corporate costs and distribution costs. That's the bulk of the cost. So when you look at a mouse and say, well, you know, how much does it cost? And by the way, I would like you to acquire the habit It will be a tremendous training experience. You may be sitting at a dinner table, pick up a spoon, and say, well, what did it take for this spoon to arrive here at my dinner table? How many people took in order for that spoon to be sitting on my dining room table? It's an exercise that absolutely overwhelmed my children. That was considered to be a major educational experience. Because a spoon on your table is a result of cooperation of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people all over the world, who all have a piece of that. Here the transaction costs were actually just getting the Logitech to a mail order house from where you order took 51% of the cost of the mouse was just paperwork, computer work, computer runs, customs declarations, airplane manifest, packing slips, and all of that. So what you really ought to understand that when people talk about the information economy, you ought to understand that the transaction cost will always dominate for just about everything, including a high-tech product. And IT is then just out there an enabler as a lubricant for getting the transaction cost managed. Sometimes it's managed well, sometimes it's not. So when you ask somebody, well, what are your outsourcing costs? Again, the theory of relativity applies. It depends who you ask. If you go to the Chinese factory manager in Shenzhen and say, what is your outsourcing ratio? He will tell you, oh, 467%. Because his inputs are $3, the outputs are $17. You go to the management of Logitech, which is in California, you say, well, what is your outsourcing ratio? It's 213%. They will give it to you accurate to the nearest decimal point. A competitor trying to displace Logitech will take a different view. They say, aha, this is really a $20.50 thing, which somebody is selling at $40. The way I'm going to kill Logitech is I'm going to go after the transaction cost, which is you, ladies and gentlemen, in IT. So now it changes the whole idea about what is really outsourcing and what is the role of IT and what is the role of competition. It is this kind of analysis that will position a CIO as a strategic actor of a corporation. I want to just illustrate to you what the Logitech mouse looks like. The transaction cost, less IT is 50%, IT is only 3%, profit is only 5%. The cost, including labor and transportation, is only 43%. There is a 50% competitive melon sitting there that somebody is going to eat. The threat to America is not labor cost, ladies and gentlemen. The threat to America is when the people who today are doing the manufacturing, in fact, will go into vertical integration. May I repeat that? The vulnerability of America is not in manufacturing cost. The vulnerability of America is right here, on the transaction cost. By the way, I've done these kind of analysis for the Department of Defense. I've usually described them in terms which appeal to the Marine Corps. It's called tooth-to-tail ratio. How much tail do you need to have any teeth? And I will not comment on my measurements. So let me then summarize the Logitech case. Outsourcing is a relative term, and it depends on where you sit. The dominant costs of global commerce are transaction costs, not labor costs. Labor cost is very efficient everywhere, and if it's not efficient, it can always move somewhere where they have robots or very cost labor to do it manually. The assembly that takes place from global sources is where technology and logistics dictate sourcing, and this is where good management knows what to do and bad management will mess it up. The greatest damage to the US economy can come from vertical integration that will reduce transaction cost by producing countries like India and China getting into business, into the value chain and into starting to buy, not maybe ports, but maybe distribution chains and mail order houses. Let me play it to you once more, because this is very, very important. As students of IT, you have to start looking at the cost structures of IT and the impact of IT, not in the context of the company, but in context of the supply chain. And it's now defined as the supply chain, distribution chain, and consumer chain. Here is a manufacturing supply chain cost. This is drawn from the automobile industry. Again, in this particular case, this is Volvo, and the purchases are just under 60%. The profit is very small. Transaction costs are 15.9%, and there are then all of these other transaction costs. Now, that is not the way to look at Volvo. The way you look at Volvo is at the tail that gets dragged in as cost of sales from the prime supplier, the secondary supplier, and the other suppliers, and so forth, and so forth. A typical manufacturers of car or copying machines or whatever, or seats, may have anywhere from 50 to 5,000 suppliers that are being integrated. In fact, companies have become systems integrators. Many of our government agencies are really systems integrators with a long tail. And so the question is, what is the visibility of the tail that connects to the head? So the total value chain basically consists out of a manufacturing value chain, a wholesaler, and a retailer value chain, so that by the time you end up with the whole value chain, you are talking about something that is about 158% of manufacturing cost. Now, the question then is, where is the vulnerability of a firm that has a long value chain spreading all over the place? And this is my estimate of what is happening today on a global scale. The old value chain at 158% has a vulnerability which is mostly at the transaction cost, which is 81% of the total value chain. Everybody, but everybody is out not so much to reduce manufacturing costs, but to reduce the cost of transaction or the information cost. It is information technology that is the cutter of total cost. When you pick up a spoon and you say, how much of the value of that spoon is steel and how much of it is information? And if you are privy to those kind of numbers, you discover what you're holding in hand is mostly information. It's absolutely startling way of looking at things. When you pick up a pill and you pop it, one of the typical things that doctors prescribe, the material cost and the manufacturing cost is insignificant. The pill is mostly information cost. Let me show you an example, and this is an automobile that cost the customer $73,691. This is an automobile that where the customer cost, which is insurance, maintenance, and repairs, and the use and interest payments on loan. There's a heavy banking cost, 43%. The automobile is only $30,000 automobile. You can still find, by the way, $30,000 automobile these days. The transaction cost in that $73,000 life cycle cost automobile is $18,000. IT is very little. It's mostly on the consumer end, all the monthly bills you get from your bank for payments that you have to make, the fees that you have to pay to the local motor vehicle bureau. I mean, start thinking about all the costs that drag along with your ownership of an automobile. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the future of an economy that's an integrated economy consists of really looking at customer costs from a customer standpoint. And it most likely will mean that the suppliers of the future will provide you an automobile service rather than an automobile delivered to you on a transaction basis. So the prediction is that with IT, services will rise much faster than manufacturing. Now, if this is so, then you have to say, well, what is a CIO? And so now I'm going to tell you that what is a CIO and what's a CTO depends on where you sit. This is, again, Strassmann's theory of relativity. If you are a corporate CTO making cars, your scope of your job is the IT budget, which is $1,397 per car. So you are not in the automobile business, you are in the IT business, and only seeing a piece of the value chain. If you happen to be then at the corporate CIO, you now have to look at the total company's embedded costs, so-called embedded costs. And your job is now worth $6,700 out of $27,000. If you say, no, I'm not just a corporate CIO of General Motors, I am the CIO of the entire value chain, which, by the way, is the proper definition, then your scope is $10,900. Now, whether CIOs will ever become information economists is debatable. Right now, my view is that unless you take the view of an information economist, namely the total cost, which is $73,000 of providing service to a customer, and from a customer standpoint, you will really not be able to get into the boardroom. The reason CIOs don't get into the boardroom because they don't really know much or care much or manage much that affects the customer. My definition of the job of the CIO of the Department of Defense is to worry about the cost of delivery to the platoon leader fighting somewhere in some godforsaken village. A CIO of the Department of Defense is not responsible for communications or data centers or any of that. That's a piece. That's a CTO kind of thing. A CIO, a true CIO, is a full service delivery expert. In conclusion, let me then say, well, where do we go with all of this thing? We should understand that we are now entering into an era of a global economic arms race where information is the vehicle by which the global economic arms race will be won or lost. The United States, for the time being, clearly enjoys dominance in the management of information. But we can let it go as soon as our competitors will discover the secrets of information economics, which they are already ready to do so. Now, in the process, lots of obsolete assets will be discarded. Many of the huge buildings full of lawyers, analysts, negotiators, purchasing agents, acquisition experts, and auditors, in fact, will have to go poof because they will be not economically sustainable. So what will happen is collaboration through information technology, what will succeed Internet, will favor global consolidation and global integration. The integrator of the future will be a global firm or global government that can do the integration. And therefore, you should start looking at IT as an economic weapon. Now, I could not resist, but I'm going to show you now an example of IT as an economic weapon. I'm going to take something that you all can touch, which is a package of Tide that is a commodity. And what I'm going to show is I'm going to compare the cost of Tide for Albertsons versus Walmart. Walmart understands information warfare, I can tell you without qualification. Now, what I'm going to show you now is the consumer price for the same package. Albertsons consumer price for the same package of Tide is $15.29. At Walmart, you can get it $12.83. Okay? Walmart has a 19% advantage. Where does that advantage come from? And by the way, this is the kind of analysis you have to learn how to perform. And the advantage comes basically mostly from transaction cost. Walmart has materially lower transaction costs. They also get better discounts because they take carload shipments of Tide and they have their own distribution system. Their logistic is slightly cheaper. In other words, competitive advantage in warfare doesn't come from one thing. It comes with slicing the advantage one slice at a time. Now, why can Walmart have a 19% advantage? By the way, this particular slide is about 18 months old. Since then, Albertsons decided to throw in the towel. They just can't make it anymore. And so will many others. Now Walmart has problems too, you know. But at any rate, I'm giving you an example of the few instances where I was able to get cross-sectional functional analysis of cost. And this is the kind of analytic capability you have to learn as students here if you want to aspire to higher position in IT. Now, let me conclude about the US economy. It's a vast subject, not really related to IT. Nevertheless, I cannot avoid looking at the fact whether the United States is really giving up its capability to offshore operators. You must understand, all outsourcing is not offshoring. And I want to point out to you there are countries living reasonably well whose outsourcing ratios, which is the ratio of imports to GDP, are 34%, 28%, 33%, 25%, 26%. United States is still at 13.5%, in fact has been decreasing. Contrary to what you read in the Washington Post, we are not getting rid of the jewels of the country. What I'm trying to tell you is we have still an enormous advantage in reaping advantages from global trade, provided we are going to set ourselves in a well-organized, well-focused way to manage it. So for Washington, I would like to conclude that anytime somebody uses outsourcing, you should not fall for the definition that that is subcontracting IT costs. Outsourcing is not off-sharing. Outsourcing is the distribution of labor through specialization. Outsourcing can be a great deal if you increase value added and if you reduce losses from divestment of knowledge. Now that is a big topic. The last bullet is a big topic. I just want to dramatize it by showing you that every night all employees take an elevator down to the parking lot and they carry in their bodies their labor costs, and in their brains they carry their knowledge capital. The question then is, are you sending out employees in order to save labor costs that also carry knowledge capital that does not even show up on your books? Well, the answer to that thing will be on April 17th. The topic will be, what is the worth of employee knowledge? You will be seeing it courtesy of Google, another knowledge company, on the web, as you will see this lecture. Thank you very much.